Imagine being just 14 years old, barely a teenager, and already pregnant with your first royal heir. Now imagine doing that not once, not twice, but over a dozen times. For centuries, royal women weren't just queens or consorts. They were breeding stock in elaborate dynastic games prized only for their ability to produce sons, and lots of them. Their wombs were not sacred, they were strategic weapons, and their bodies were battlegrounds where politics, patriarchy, and pain collided. These women didn't fear childbirth, they feared surviving it only to be forced back into the royal bed again before their bodies had even healed. They weren't raising their children. Most were handed off to wet nurses and tutors, while the mothers returned to endless cycles of pregnancy and grief. Miscarriages were hidden, stillbirths were whispered about. Dead infants were buried quietly without ceremony. Their value counted in stretch marks and tombstones. And yet these women kept going not because they were strong, but because they had no choice. In today's episode, we're uncovering the most haunting stories of queens in history who gave birth to staggering numbers of children, 14, 16, even 23 times often at the cost of their health, sanity, and sometimes their lives. This is not a celebration of fertility. It's a reckoning with a hidden history of suffering that shaped empires. She was the most beloved woman in the Mughal Empire, and yet she died in agony alone in childbirth, her body torn apart by the very role that made her valuable. Mumtaz Mahal was never meant to be just another wife. She was Shah Jahan's soulmate, his trusted advisor, his obsession. In a world where emperors married for politics, Mumtaz was the rare queen who ruled her husband's heart completely. But even love couldn't protect her from the brutal expectations of royal motherhood. At just 19, she married the future emperor, and over the next 2 decades, she bore him 14 children, a staggering number even by royal standards. 7 died in infancy, a cruel reminder that in the 1600s giving birth wasn't a miracle, it was a gamble with death. Still, Mumtaz traveled with Shah Jahan on military campaigns, consulted on court matters, and held real influence. She was more than a consort, she was a pillar of the empire. But her womb was not immortal. In 1631, while accompanying the emperor on a military mission, Mumtaz went into labor with her 14th child. The delivery lasted 30 excruciating hours. Her body, already worn thin from years of pregnancy and grief, couldn't take it. She bled to death shortly after giving birth to a daughter, Gohar. The empire mourned, but no one more than Shah Jahan. He locked himself away for months, his hair turning white from grief. And from that bottomless sorrow, he ordered the construction of the Taj Mahal, not as a palace of power, but as a tomb of love. But even that monument, glorious as it is, hides the darker truth. Mumtaz Mahal died not from war, not from disease, but from being the perfect royal wife. Her death was not unique. It was a pattern. The cost of empire was paid in the blood of women, like her women who were adored in life, but destroyed by duty. So the next time you see the Taj Mahal, remember this. It's not just a wonder of the world. It's a gravestone, a haunting tribute to a woman whose only crime was giving too much of herself to history and never living long enough to see her children grow. She was a queen, but she felt more like a prisoner. When Queen Charlotte of Great Britain wrote, "I don't think a prisoner could wish more ardently for his liberty than I wish to be rid of my burden," she wasn't talking about war or politics. She was talking about her own body, pregnant for the 14th time, suffocating under the weight of duty, motherhood, and monarchy. In the gilded halls of Buckingham Palace, Charlotte smiled for portraits and hosted dignitaries, but behind closed doors, she was being quietly broken, one child at a time. Married to King George III at just 17, Charlotte quickly fulfilled her role as queen consort by giving birth to their first child, the future George IV, within a year. What followed was nothing short of staggering 15 children in 21 years, not as a result of passion, but expectation. Her body became the property of the crown, a biological factory, tasked with producing heirs and alliances. While the world romanticized the royal nursery, Charlotte lived in a state of constant fatigue and fear. Every pregnancy brought the risk of death. Every child carried the weight of political meaning. And there was no pause, no choice, no relief. Yet she wasn't cold or distant. Charlotte loved her children deeply. She mourned the deaths of two young sons, Alfred and Octavius, who died of smallpox, and fiercely protected her daughters. Perhaps haunted by her own endless cycle of pregnancies, she delayed their marriages, educated them thoroughly, and tried desperately to give them the freedom she never had. Ironically, none of her daughters had surviving children. The line stopped there. As George III's mind unraveled into madness, Charlotte remained a steady presence, first as queen, then as regent in all but name. But her soul was worn thin. She had lived through a battlefield of the body, a war of expectations disguised as love and loyalty. She died at 74, surrounded by her children, but haunted by what motherhood had cost her. Queen Charlotte wasn't remembered for conquests or revolutions. She was remembered for her womb, and that's the tragedy. She gave the British monarchy its future, but in return lost nearly all of herself. Her legacy isn't just a long royal family tree, it's a warning. Even queens can be buried alive under the weight of duty. She was married at 13, pregnant by 14, and dead before 50, not from illness or assassination, but from sheer exhaustion. Eleanor of Castile. Queen of England and wife of the infamous Edward the Fern, gave birth to 16 children, while riding beside her husband on brutal military campaigns across medieval Europe. She didn't sit on a throne, she marched beside it. Through war zones, plague-ridden towns, and unforgiving terrain, Eleanor endured it all, pregnant, grieving, bleeding, surviving. But the crown didn't ask if she could bear it. It only demanded that she must. Unlike many royal marriages, Eleanor and Edward shared a rare love. He was a ruthless conqueror. Longshanks, the hammer of the Scots, but with her he was faithful and devoted. And yet that devotion never spared her the cruelty of her role. Eleanor's first child died within days. Her next two, Catherine and Joan, also died in infancy. 4 children gone before she turned 17. And still the kingdom expected more. The deaths kept coming. Some lived just long enough to walk. Others died unnamed. Only one son, Alfonso, survived to age 10, England's precious heir, and when he died, suddenly the royal court was thrown into panic. Desperate, Eleanor conceived again in her 40s. Her final child, Edward II, was born not from joy but necessity, a last-ditch effort to keep the dynasty alive. That child would go on to become one of England's most tragic kings. But Eleanor would not live to see it. In 1290, while traveling through northern England, still accompanying Edward on campaign, Eleanor caught malaria. Her body, ravaged by decades of childbirth and grief, couldn't fight anymore. She died at 48. Edward was devastated. In perhaps the grandest display of medieval mourning, he ordered 12 stone crosses to be built along the exact route of her funeral procession from Lincoln to London. But no number of crosses could undo the suffering she endured while alive. Eleanor's story is not just a tale of maternal sacrifice, it's a quiet indictment of royal duty. She was a queen on the battlefield, but the real war was waged inside her body. We remember her for her loyalty, her endurance, her legacy. But what we should remember is this: she didn't die as a hero. She died as a woman who was never allowed to rest. She gave birth to 16 children and watched 3 of them become kings, only to be murdered one after another. Queen Keran of Armenia didn't rule from a throne, she ruled from a birthing bed, from grief, and finally from a stone cell in a monastery. In a world where queens were praised for fertility but punished for power, her story is one of quiet devastation hidden beneath a veil of royal virtue. Keran, born a Turkish princess in the 13th century, married King Leo II of Armenia before she was 20. She was praised for her beauty, loyalty, and kindness, but no one wrote about the toll of 10 single births and 3 sets of twins. Her womb was relentless. Her body stretched, torn, and repaired itself again and again, as if being queen meant being invincible. But the cost was written in the names of dead sons. Her first 3 children, unnamed Constantine and Theophilus, died young. Her 4th, Hethum II, became king. He was murdered. Her 6th, Tauros III, also became king. Also murdered. The youngest of the royal line, Ashen, took the crown next. He too was murdered. This wasn't just succession, it was slaughter. The very sons she gave her life to bring into the world were devoured by the violent politics of the medieval Armenian court. One by one, her children were crowned. One by one, she buried them. And what did the queen do after giving everything she left? No palace. No speeches. No glory. Just silence. After her final childbirth, Keran quietly retired to a monastery, cutting her hair, shedding her royal name, and disappearing into a life of prayer and grief. She died in 1285 not as a queen but as a nun, her hands no longer holding power, only rosary beads. Her story isn't famous. You won't see her name in textbooks, but Keran represents something brutally universal, the invisibility of maternal sacrifice. She created kings and lost them. She shaped a kingdom and was erased from it. She wasn't dethroned, she was dissolved by expectation. In the end, Queen Keran didn't abdicate. She surrendered because after 16 births, 3 murdered sons, and a heart stretched beyond human endurance, there was simply nothing left of her to give. She ruled an empire with one hand and cradled a newborn in the other. While most monarchs led armies into battle, Maria Theresa of Austria fought a different kind of war, the battle to maintain power while bearing 16 children in just 19 years. She wasn't just the only woman to rule the Habsburg dominions in her own right, she was also one of the most prolific mothers in royal history. But behind her image as a commanding empress lay a woman constantly torn between political strategy and physical survival. Married at 19 to Francis Stephen of Lorraine, Maria Theresa fell in love. But love didn't shield her from betrayal. While she governed one of Europe's largest empires, facing down Prussia, launching reforms and fighting for her right to rule, Francis chased mistresses across Vienna. So she did what powerful women have always done in a man's world: she took control. She crowned him emperor, then locked him out of real decision-making. But her true burden wasn't her husband, it was her biology. Child after child, year after year, her body became a vessel for dynastic ambition. 16 births, 13 surviving children, many of whom she used like chess pieces to secure alliances across Europe. One daughter, Marie Antoinette, would one day lose her head in the French Revolution. A son became the Holy Roman Emperor. A third became Archbishop of Cologne. To Maria Theresa, motherhood was diplomacy by other means. Yet even an empress couldn't control everything. Smallpox ravaged her family, taking multiple children. In response, she became a fierce advocate for smallpox inoculation centuries ahead of her time. Still, tragedy stalked her. Her beloved husband died suddenly of a stroke, and though she wore black in mourning for the rest of her life, she never forgave his betrayals. Even grief for her was laced with power. Maria Theresa died at 63, exhausted but undefeated. She left behind a fractured Europe, a legacy of reform, and a trail of royal bloodlines shaped by her womb. History remembers her as a ruler, a mother, a woman of iron will. But the truth is deeper. She didn't just build a dynasty, she bled for it. Her body bore the empire's future, and her mind held it together. And in doing so, she proved that the crown weighs twice as much when worn by a woman. She begged not to go. At just 15 years old, Maria Carolina of Austria clung to her mother's skirts, weeping, terrified that marriage to the King of Naples was a death sentence. And in a way it was. Her 3 sisters had already been promised to him, all died of smallpox before the wedding. Now it was her turn. No love, no choice. Just dynastic duty wrapped in silk and fear. But what no one expected was that the terrified girl sent to marry a crude and lazy king would become one of the most powerful and paranoid queens in Europe. Maria Carolina was the daughter of Maria Theresa and sister to Marie Antoinette, and she inherited both their strengths and their fates. Disgusted by her husband Ferdinand I, who famously complained about their wedding night in public, she nevertheless did her job. She gave birth to 17 children, though only 7 survived. The palace walls echoed with screams, not of celebration, but of childbirth fever and grief. But while her body broke under royal expectation, her mind only grew sharper. Ferdinand ruled in name, but Maria Carolina ruled in practice. She built her own court, influenced foreign policy, and maneuvered her children into powerful marriages across Europe. She mirrored her mother's methods, weaponizing motherhood as statecraft. But power in the shadows breeds paranoia. As Napoleon rose and war crept closer, Maria Carolina became increasingly erratic. She trusted no one. She plotted alliances in secret, corresponded with spies, and turned her court into a web of surveillance. Every surviving child was a bargaining chip, every betrayal a knife closer to her back. When Napoleon invaded, the royal family fled to Austria. The queen, who once ruled from a marble throne, was reduced to writing desperate letters in a borrowed house. She died of a stroke at 62, surrounded by papers, half-written orders, and fading portraits of the children she had birthed, buried, and politicized. Maria Carolina wasn't just a mother. She was a stateswoman, a manipulator, and a survivor. But her life reminds us the more a woman rose in royal power, the more she had to trade pieces of herself, her body, her mind, her peace. In the end, she didn't lose her crown. She unraveled beneath it. She was Queen of England, Scotland, and Ireland, ruler of a powerful empire, but couldn't do the one thing her kingdom demanded most: produce a living heir. Behind the crown jewels and royal processions, Queen Anne lived a life defined not by victory, but by loss. A cycle of hope and heartbreak repeated 18 times. Miscarriage, stillbirth, infant death, over and over again. She was a mother to a nation, but never to a child who lived. Married to Prince George of Denmark at 18, Anne found unexpected comfort in a quiet, affectionate marriage. Together they dreamed of a large family, but their dreams would become a living nightmare. Their first child, a stillborn daughter. Then 2 little girls, Mary and Anne Sophia, who died of smallpox before age 2. Anne miscarried again and again, sometimes without even leaving her bedchamber. In 1 year alone, she lost 3 pregnancies. Her 7th child, Prince William, was a glimmer of hope, the Duke of Gloucester, her miracle baby. He survived infancy, learned to walk, talk, and even play. She dared to believe. But at just 11 years old, he died suddenly of an unknown illness, shattering her completely. Doctors now suspect Anne suffered from Hughes syndrome, a blood clotting disorder that made it nearly impossible for her body to carry a pregnancy to term. A simple aspirin could have saved her children, but no one knew that then. Instead, she suffered in silence, her body swelling with gout, her spirit sinking under the weight of invisible graves. And still, the court whispered. Was she cursed? Was God punishing her? Even in power, she was surrounded by pressure. The survival of the Stuart dynasty depended on her womb. Parliament grew anxious. Europe watched. She kept trying, kept failing. Her last pregnancy ended in miscarried twins too early to even name. By the time she died in 1714, not a single one of her 18 children had survived. Queen Anne wasn't a tragic mother. She was a monument to grief, to the agony of repeating the same hope, the same trauma over and over again. Her body was a battlefield where love and duty collided and no one won. In a world that measured a queen's worth by her heirs, Anne left behind no heir but an unforgettable legacy of pain. She gave birth to more children than any queen in recorded history, 23. And yet she died in exile, powerless, forgotten, watching from afar as the 1,000-year dynasty she tried to protect was erased in a single stroke. Queen Darejan of Georgia didn't just create life, she tried to build an empire through her womb. But the sons she bore became weapons in a war that shattered her legacy, and the price she paid was everything. Born a Georgian princess in 1738, Darejan was married off at just 12 years old to the much older King Heraclius II, a widower with 4 sons already from a previous marriage. The child bride quickly became queen and began the relentless work of producing heirs. For the next 30 years, Darejan's life was a blur of childbirth, mourning, and ambition. Of her 23 children, 13 survived an extraordinary feat in the 18th century, but that blessing would soon turn into a curse. Darejan wanted one thing for her sons, not her stepsons, to inherit the throne, and she fought like a queen and mother possessed. She pressured Heraclius to write a will disinheriting his eldest son from his first marriage, installing her own children as heirs. When Heraclius died, the carefully crafted succession collapsed. His eldest king, George XV, tore up the will and declared Darejan a manipulator. The queen mother fought back. Her sons, Miran, Alexander, and Paranoia, sought foreign allies, igniting a bitter internal war. One faction turned to Russia, the other to Persia. It wasn't just a family feud, it was a geopolitical disaster. And then the unthinkable happened. Russia intervened not to help, but to conquer. In 1801, Tsar Alexander I annexed Georgia, ending the Bagrationi dynasty's 1,000-year reign. Darejan begged the Tsar to make one of her sons king. He refused. Instead, he sent her and her surviving children to live under surveillance in St. Petersburg, stripped of titles, land, and hope. She died in 1807, not in a palace, but in a rented house thousands of miles from her homeland. The queen who gave Georgia its last princes lived just long enough to see her bloodline extinguished. She didn't lose a crown, she lost a kingdom. And she lost it to the very children she gave everything to protect. They wore crowns, but what they carried was far heavier than gold. These queens, Mumtaz, Mahal, Charlotte, Eleanor, Keran, Maria, Theresa, Maria, Carolina, Anne, and Darejan lived in palaces but bled, mourned, and suffered like ordinary women, only without the freedom to stop. Their stories are not fairy tales. They are cautionary epics written in childbirth scars, whispered prayers, and the cold silence of royal tombs. They gave birth to kings, but few were allowed to mother their children. They built dynasties but lost themselves in the process. This isn't just history, it's a mirror. For centuries, a woman's worth was measured by how many sons she produced, how many alliances she secured, how much pain she could endure in silence. These queens were praised not for their minds, but for their wombs. And yet behind every coronation, every treaty, every marble monument, there was a woman exhausted, grieving, sometimes dying, who made it possible. Their children became emperors, archbishops, revolutionaries. But the price was often their mother's life, sanity, or soul. The lesson is clear: power, when built on the backs of women's bodies, is never noble, it's parasitic. And even today, the echoes remain. Modern women still battle the expectations of perfect motherhood, relentless productivity, and self-sacrifice. The pressure to have it all may look different, but the roots run deep. We are still telling women that their value lies in what they produce, not in who they are. So let these queens be remembered, not just for their bloodlines, but for their endurance. Not for their crowns, but for their courage. They remind us that true strength is not in bearing children. It's in surviving a world that never asked if they wanted to. To every woman today, struggling to balance identity with expectation, body with obligation, love with loss, you are not alone. History is full of women like you. And maybe it's time we start honoring them, not for what they gave to the world, but for what the world took from them. Because the most powerful legacy isn't royal blood. It's reclaiming the right to live fully, freely, and on your own terms. If this story moved you, shocked you, or made you see history in a new light, don't keep it to yourself. Drop a comment below and tell us which queen's story hit you the hardest. Save this video so you never forget the hidden sacrifices behind royal power. And if you want more untold truths, forgotten women, and history that cuts deep, hit that subscribe button. We're just getting started.